nobody asked the moon for permission. That was the thing Ambassador Cale Duran kept returning to, long after the hearings ended and the formal protests were filed and ignored. The Veth Dominion had moved with the quiet efficiency of an empire that had been doing this for 3,000 years. They did not announce. They did not request. They arrived with their deep-boring machines and their survey drones, established a geothermal extraction perimeter in the subregolith strata below the Tycho Basin, and began drilling. Earth's Orbital Defense Consortium detected the seismic signature on a Tuesday. It registered as unusual. By Wednesday it was classified. By Thursday, satellite imaging had confirmed the scope of the operation: 17 boreheads, each nearly 400 meters in diameter, sinking into the lunar mantle with a precision that implied months of prior reconnaissance. The Veth had been watching Earth's moon for a long time. Duran was called to the emergency session of the Galactic Compact within 48 hours. He had served as Earth's senior diplomatic envoy for 9 years, long enough to understand that the Compact's emergency sessions rarely produced emergencies and rarely solved them either. They were a pressure valve. They let civilizations feel heard without committing the Compact to actually doing anything. He sat at the long crescent table in the Compact's orbital station above the gas giant Seraph and looked across at Veth Consul Prime Orith, who had the calm, loose posture of someone attending a meeting they consider beneath their attention. The subregolith extraction is within permissible bounds under Article 12 of the Shared Systems Covenant, Orith said, before Duran had even finished presenting Earth's formal objection. Luna is an unclaimed natural satellite. Humanity's territorial assertions extend to the surface, not the interior. Duran set down his data tablet. You're extracting from beneath our navigational infrastructure. 3 of the boreheads are operating directly below the lunar relay array. The relay array occupies the surface. The extraction operation is 700 meters below it. The seismic activity from the drilling has already disrupted 2 of the array's stabilization anchors. Orith spread 2 of his 4 hands in a gesture the translator program identified as something between a shrug and a dismissal. Infrastructure maintenance is a human responsibility. The Dominion cannot be held accountable for inadequate engineering. The session continued for 4 hours. It produced a non-binding resolution calling for mutual restraint and continued dialogue. 3 of the 7 voting blocs abstained. 2 voted in favor of the resolution, which carried no enforcement mechanism. 1 bloc, the Korith Collective, voted against it on the grounds that non-binding resolutions were philosophically incoherent and they refused to participate in the theater of them. Duran agreed with the Korith, but kept that opinion off the record. He returned to Earth's Compact delegation suite and spent 3 hours filing reports. Then he opened the encrypted channel to Dr. Sarah Mullen at the Lunar Geology and Infrastructure Survey Office, who had been his technical advisor for 6 years and had the useful quality of saying exactly what she believed regardless of diplomatic consequences. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Depends on what they're after," she said. Her feed was slightly pixelated from the signal delay. She was currently stationed at the Tycho monitoring post, close enough to feel the vibration in her boots when the borehead cycled. "I've been running spectrographic analysis on the thermal signatures coming out of those holes. Whatever the Veth are pulling up, it's not geothermal energy. The isotope profile is wrong." Duran felt something cold settle in the back of his mind. "What is it?" Mullen hesitated for just a moment, which was unusual for her. "It looks like they found something down there, Cale. Something that was already there. Something that isn't natural." The call ended. Duran sat in the quiet of the delegation suite and thought about the fact that humanity had been on the moon for 240 years, and in all that time, no geological survey had gone deeper than 300 meters into the regolith. The Veth were at 700 and still going. He pulled up the Article 12 provisions again and read them slowly. Unclaimed natural satellites. The phrase rested in his vision for a long time. He thought about the word natural. Then he requested an emergency secure briefing with the Earth Defense Science Division and began drafting a very different kind of message than the ones he'd been sending all week. Dr. Mullen had a gift for understatement that Duran had always appreciated, but the briefing she delivered 47 hours after their first call suggested she had been holding back considerably. She had transmitted the full data package to the Earth Defense Science Division simultaneously, and the room in Geneva where Duran sat with 7 senior analysts contained the kind of quiet that comes from people who are very intelligent and very alarmed trying to maintain professional composure. "The isotope signature is artificial," she said, her voice flat and precise over the secure channel. "Specifically, it matches a decay profile consistent with materials that have undergone directed neutron bombardment. Not natural radioactive decay. Engineered decay. Something was irradiated down there, deliberately, and then sealed." One of the analysts, a woman named Dr. Priya Voss who specialized in non-terrestrial material science, leaned forward. "How old?" "The decay curve puts the original irradiation event at somewhere between 11,000 and 13,000 years ago. We're still refining the estimate." The room stayed quiet. 11,000 years ago, humanity had been building the first agricultural settlements in the Fertile Crescent. The most advanced technology on Earth had been fired clay pottery and the domestication of goats. "So whatever is down there," Duran said carefully, "was placed there by something that wasn't us." "Correct. And the Veth found it." "The question," said Admiral Renu Thakur, who was attending the briefing from the Orbital Defense Consortium's command station, "is whether they found it recently or whether they've known about it for longer." That question had no immediate answer, but it reorganized everything. The Veth Dominion's move on Tycho was not opportunistic resource extraction. It was a retrieval operation. They had come specifically for this, with 17 boreheads and months of prior reconnaissance, with exact coordinates and a legal cover story prepared in advance. They had known, and they had planned, and they had decided that whatever was buried beneath Earth's moon was worth the diplomatic friction of taking it while humanity was still junior enough in the Galactic Compact to have no practical means of stopping them. Mullen continued her briefing. The thermal imaging from the borehead suggested a sealed chamber approximately 40 meters in diameter at a depth of 730 meters, and the Veth machines had reached approximately 680 meters as of her last reading. They were close. Maybe days away from whatever was down there. "Can we identify what it is?" Voss asked. "Not from the surface. The regolith is attenuating everything. But the mass estimates from gravitational microlensing suggest the chamber contains something dense. Very dense. Denser than anything you'd expect to find in the lunar interior." Mullen pulled up a figure. "Around 42,000 metric tons, contained in a structure approximately 40 meters across." Thakur did the math aloud, slowly. "That's a material density of." "It's not a natural material," Mullen said. "Whatever it is, it was manufactured." The discussion that followed lasted 6 hours. Duran said little. He was thinking about a different problem, the diplomatic one, which in some ways was more tractable and in other ways was considerably worse. The Compact's legal framework was clear: the Veth were technically within their rights under Article 12. The lunar interior was unclaimed under existing treaty. To stop the extraction, Earth would need to either demonstrate that the object in the chamber constituted a threat to Earth specifically, which required knowledge of what it was, or establish that the installation predated the Covenant entirely, which would trigger an entirely different legal framework. The Pre-Covenant Preservation Act covered artifacts of Compact member civilizations discovered in unclaimed space. If the chamber was ancient enough, and if the object could be classified as a cultural or technological artifact, the jurisdiction question became very different. But the Act had a condition: the species responsible for the artifact had to be identified, and if that species was extinct, the Compact's Archaeocultural Office held primary jurisdiction. Nobody knew who had built the chamber. And the Veth were drilling toward it with 50 meters left to go. Duran requested a second session before the Compact, this time invoking the Pre-Covenant Preservation Act provisions. He had no idea if it would work. He filed the documentation anyway, meticulously, because the documentation was also a record, and records had a way of maturing later in ways you couldn't predict. Then he called Mullen back on the secure line. Is there any way to tell what it does? He asked. She was quiet for longer than she usually was. The monitoring station hummed faintly behind her. No, she said. But I've been thinking about the geometry of the ceiling structure. The irradiation wasn't just preservation. It was deliberate contamination, the kind you'd use to make something impossible to use without the right counteragent. Someone didn't just hide this thing. She paused. They locked it. The second session before the Galactic Compact went exactly as Duran had expected, which was poorly, and slightly better than he had feared, which was enough. The Pre-Covenant Preservation Act argument did not stop the Veth drilling. Consul Prime Oritha's legal team had clearly anticipated this avenue and arrived with a counterfiling already prepared, citing the Act's jurisdictional limitation to artifacts connected to identifiable civilizations. Unknown origin, they argued, meant unclaimed. Unclaimed meant free access under Article 12. Duran had known this was the likely outcome. He had filed the motion anyway, because the motion created a legal record, and the record triggered mandatory notification to the Compact's Archaeocultural Office, and that notification required a 48-hour review hold before extraction of any material from the chamber could proceed. He had not gotten the Veth to stop. He had gotten them to slow down by 2 days. It was not a victory. But 2 days was 2 days. He spent the first of those 2 days on a call with Dr. Voss and a historian named Professor Alamu Tesfaye from the Compact's Open Academic Registry, who had spent 30 years studying pre-Covenant stellar civilizations and had the kind of encyclopedic pattern recognition that made him valuable when you needed to identify something from a small sample of indirect evidence. "Walk me through the chamber again," Tesfaye said. His office was somewhere near Addis Ababa, judging by the angle of the light in his window, and he had the manner of a man who found most things interesting and very few things truly surprising. He listened to the full data package without interrupting. When it was done, he was quiet for a moment. "The neutron bombardment ceiling," he said. "The specific decay profile. I want to see the mass and dimension estimates side by side with the depth." Mullen's data came up on the shared screen. Tesfaye studied it. His expression did not change, exactly, but something in the quality of his attention shifted. "You said 42,000 metric tons in a 40-meter chamber," he said. "Approximately. And the depth of placement was 730 meters. Not 500. Not 300. 730. Yes. That's below the primary seismic fracture layer. Below anything that would be reached by standard geological survey. Below anything a civilization with pre-spaceflight technology could reach." He leaned back. "But not below anything a civilization in the early expansion period of interstellar development could reach. You'd need controlled deep excavation capability, basic anti-seismic drilling, and precise coordinate locking across a geological timeframe. Who could do that 11,000 years ago?" Tesfaye was quiet again. "One civilization that we know of. The Setheran." The word landed in the room with a particular weight. Duran recognized it from general historical context. The Setheran were the oldest confirmed spacefaring species in the Compact's historical record, extinct for approximately 9,000 years, known primarily from architectural remnants on a handful of pre-expansion worlds. They were considered progenitors, distant and abstract. The Setheran were in this region of space 11,000 years ago, Tesfaye continued. Their expansion mapped along the spiral arm. Earth's system would have been well within their exploratory range. He paused. And they were known for one particular engineering philosophy. They called it dormant guarantorship. The practice of placing irreversible strategic assets in third-party systems specifically to deter interference with civilizations they considered to be in developmental stages. Duran set down his coffee very carefully. They put weapons in the moons of developing worlds. Not exactly weapons. The Setheran terminology translates more accurately as equilibrium mechanisms. Things designed to ensure that no single party could leverage advantage over a developing species without consequence. Tesfaye folded his hands. They did this in at least 4 other documented cases. In each case, the mechanism was designed to be impossible to activate without the specific biological or cryptographic key belonging to the protected species. The room was quiet. And in the 4 documented cases, Duran said slowly, did the mechanisms ever get activated? In 2 of them, yes. When other parties attempted to retrieve or weaponize the mechanisms, the activation keys proved to be held by the protected species themselves, encoded in their biology or their earliest technological artifacts. Voss looked at Duran. Duran looked at the data package on the screen. Then he looked back at Tesfaye. "Professor," he said. "I need you to tell me everything about how the Setheran designed their activation keys." It took 14 hours to find the answer, and it had been sitting in humanity's genomic record for 30,000 years. Dr. Voss ran the initial cross-reference. She was working from Tesfaye's documentation on the 2 confirmed Setheran mechanism cases, one from the Reth system, where the protected species had died out before activating anything and left only ruins, and one from the Kaldori system, where the mechanism had activated after an external party attempted extraction and had responded by broadcasting a signal that locked down the external party's navigational systems for 70 years. The Kaldori case was the more useful one. In that instance, the activation key had been embedded in the Kaldori's earliest written language, specifically in a sequence of symbolic characters that appeared in their foundational texts and which the Setheran had apparently encoded as a resonance pattern in the mechanism's control matrix. The Setheran, Tesfaye explained, were precise about this. They did not want mechanisms that could be triggered accidentally or by outside parties. The keys were always biological or cultural, tied to the specific developmental fingerprint of the species being protected. Symbols, sequences, neural firing patterns, biochemical markers. Things that emerged from the organic development of a species and could not be mimicked or synthesized without access to the species itself. "So we're looking for something foundational," Voss said. "Something that would have been present in early humanity and that could have been encoded before humans had spaceflight." "Encoded in what?" Duran asked. "In whatever they left as the control interface. Assume the mechanism has a sensor array. The Setheran had quantum state sensing technology. They could encode recognition patterns at the atomic level." Tesfaye pulled up a comparison diagram from the Kaldori case. The pattern was embedded in their language. But the language was a reflection of their neural architecture. So ultimately the key was neurological. Voss was already running a cross-reference. Human DNA has multiple non-coding regions that show no evolutionary precursor. Sequences that appear fully formed in early modern humans with no ancestral gradient. We've always categorized them as junk sequences or viral remnants. She pulled up a specific cluster. This one, in chromosome 7, has a base pair arrangement that doesn't match any viral insertion pattern we've ever cataloged. It's in 97% of all humans tested. It appears in remains going back at least 40,000 years. She put it alongside the Setheran encoding pattern from the Kaldori documentation. The room went very quiet. "They wrote it into us," Duran said. "They wrote something into our genome that could serve as a recognition key," Voss said carefully. "I'm not saying it definitely is. I'm saying we need to test it. We have 50 hours before the review hold expires and the Veth resume drilling," Duran said. The next 20 hours were a controlled sprint. The Earth Defense Science Division had a quantum resonance testing lab aboard the orbital station Cassini, originally built for analyzing captured compact Terra artifacts. They repurposed its sensing array for a different task, constructing a signal based on the chromosome 7 sequence and broadcasting it at the frequency range used by Setheran control interfaces, as documented in the Kaldori case files. They didn't know if there was any receiver left operational in the lunar chamber. 11,000 years was a long time. The sealing radiation suggested the Setheran had tried to preserve the mechanism, but there was no guarantee the control matrix was still functional. They broadcast the signal at 0400 station time. It was, from the outside, a very quiet moment. A few technicians in a repurposed lab, a narrowband transmission aimed at a specific point on the lunar surface, a signal based on a sequence of base pairs that had been sitting in human DNA since before the first cities. Nothing happened for 4 minutes. Then Mullen's monitoring station at Tycho registered a seismic event. Not from the Veth boreheads. Something deeper. Something expanding outward from the chamber. Mullen's voice came over the line, flat with the specific control she used when she was trying not to sound as unsettled as she was. Kale. The chamber is opening. From the inside. The Veth drilling operations went silent at 0411 station time. Not because anyone told them to stop. The borehead simply lost contact with their control systems. All 17 of them, simultaneously. The Veth operational command aboard their extraction vessel tried to re-establish connection for 23 minutes before concluding that something outside their equipment had interrupted the signal. The something was a field, expanding outward from the chamber in a perfect sphere, passing through 700 meters of lunar regolith as if it weren't there, through the surface, through the vacuum above it, through the holes of everything within approximately 900 kilometers of the Tycho Basin. It did not damage anything. It did not produce radiation above background levels. It did not hurt anyone. It simply passed through every piece of technology in its radius and, in passing, introduced a very specific error state into every active control system it touched. Not a crash. Not an erasure. A pause. Every non-biological process dependent on computational logic within the field's radius paused for 11 seconds and then resumed normal operation. 11 seconds. No permanent damage. No injuries. Just 11 seconds of silence in every machine within 900 kilometers of the Tycho Basin. The Veth borehead spent those 11 seconds in a state of complete electronic suspension. When they came back online, they were operational, but the borehead operators found that every navigation and targeting system had been reset to default, erasing the precise coordinates they had programmed for the final 50 meters of approach. Reprogramming the coordinates from scratch would have taken hours. But the deeper issue was that the chamber itself, as imaged by Mullen's sensors, had changed configuration. Whatever had been inside had moved. Not much. Perhaps 3 meters in any given direction. But the borehead operators were working to within centimeter tolerances. At 3 meters off course, they risked a catastrophic structural compromise to the drilling apparatus. The Veth called a temporary halt. Durin spent those hours in the compact station's observation corridor watching the gas giant Sarath rotate below him and thinking about what had just happened. The mechanism had not been a weapon in any conventional sense. It had not fired at the Veth. It had not destroyed their equipment. It had interrupted their operation, precisely and briefly, in a way that cost them time and coordination without giving them a legitimate grievance. There was no attack to file a complaint about. There was an anomalous seismic event and an unexplained electromagnetic phenomenon. The Veth legal team would struggle to characterize it as an act of aggression because nothing had been damaged and no one had been harmed. The Setheran had been very, very careful. Thakur contacted Durin from the Orbital Defense Consortium. She had been running analysis on the field's propagation pattern. It's not just the boreheads, she said. Every piece of Veth equipment within the radius experienced that reset. Including their extraction vessel's main navigational array. Are they leaving? No. But they're not drilling either. They're sending survey drones down to reimage the chamber location. Thakur paused. Kale, the mechanism is still active. Mullen's sensors are picking up a continuous low-frequency emission from the chamber. It's below what the borehead's operating frequency would trigger, but it's there. Like a warning system. Like a system that knows it's being watched and is signaling that it's awake. Another pause. Voss says the field pulse correlated almost exactly with the broadcast we sent. Timing to within milliseconds. So it had heard them. 11,000 years asleep under the moon, and it had heard the signal composed from the sequence in human chromosome 7, and it had woken up and done exactly what the Setheran had designed it to do, not destroy, not repel, just complicate. Make the extraction cost more than it was worth. Shift the calculation. Durin requested an emergency plenary session of the compact. Not a committee meeting. Not a subcommission. The full plenary, which had not convened an emergency session in 31 years. He cited the Pre-Covenant Preservation Act, the Severin attribution evidence, the genomic key documentation, and the mechanism's confirmed activation. And for the first time in the proceedings, he felt something other than the contained frustration of a junior diplomat arguing procedure against an empire that considered procedure a courtesy extended to the manageable. He felt the weight shift. The Veth had come to retrieve something before humanity knew it existed. That window had closed. The compact now knew about the mechanism, about the Severin attribution, and about the activation key embedded in human biology. Whatever the mechanism was, it was now legally, evidentially, and functionally connected to humanity in a way that pre-existed the Galactic Compact itself. The question was no longer whether Earth had a claim. The question was what came after the claim was established. The plenary session lasted 3 days. Durin had not slept properly in 90 hours. He had eaten at irregular intervals and developed a specific ache behind his right eye that he had learned to treat as a signal to drink water and keep moving. He sat through 11 formal statements, 2 procedural challenges, 1 attempt by the Veth legal team to reclassify the mechanism's activation as a potential act of aggression by Earth against Veth extraction equipment, and a 4-hour recess during which Professor Tesfaye testified before the Archaeocultural Committee via secure feed from his office in Addis Ababa, surrounded by data panels and the focused calm of a man who had been waiting 30 years for someone to ask him the right questions. Tesfaye's testimony was the pivot. He had spent the preceding 48 hours cross-referencing the Severin historical record with the specific characteristics of the Tycho mechanism as observed by Mullen's sensors. The activation field's pulse duration. The frequency of the low-level emission. The precise depth of placement. The decay profile of the ceiling radiation. Each data point, individually, was consistent with multiple interpretations. Together, they were a signature. There are 6 documented Severin installation sites in the compact's historical record, Tesfaye told the Archaeocultural Committee. The Tycho mechanism matches the installation profile of the protective class sites, not the observation class or archival class sites. Specifically, it matches the profile of the 2 mechanisms known to have been calibrated to a species-specific activation key. He paused to let that land. In both of those cases, the Severin placed the mechanisms in the immediate gravitational vicinity of the protected species home system. Not adjacent systems. Not the home world itself. The nearest large natural satellite of the home world. Why the satellite? Asked the Korath representative, who was attending in an advisory capacity and had a habit of asking the questions other delegates considered too obvious to voice. Because a mechanism placed on the home world would be at risk from the protected species' own developmental accidents, atmospheric events, geological activity, early warfare. A mechanism placed in deep space is too far to be reliably accessible. A mechanism in the immediate natural satellite is within developmental reach of the protected species as soon as they achieve spaceflight, but deep enough in the regolith to be inaccessible to them before they have the technical capability to use what they'd find. Tesfaye folded his hands. The Severin were patient. They were also precise. They designed these mechanisms to become accessible to the protected species at exactly the point when those species were developed enough to understand what they had found. The Korath representative considered this. And the key in the biological record. Standard Severin practice for protective installations. The key is in the species because the key has to be in something that survives. Political institutions change. Languages evolve. Technology becomes obsolete. But 97% genomic penetration in a key sequence means the recognition pattern survives even catastrophic population events. Tesfaye's voice was dry and precise. They were thorough. The committee chair asked the question that had been hovering over the entire proceeding. Does the mechanism's classification as a protective installation affect jurisdiction under the Pre-Covenant Preservation Act? The legal answer came from the Compact's chief jurisprudence officer, a Sethri-descended advocate named Mira On, who had been quietly reviewing the Act's implementation history for the past 40 hours. Yes, she said. The Pre-Covenant Preservation Act's protective provision, Article 7, Section 4, establishes that mechanisms placed in a system by an extinct civilization for the explicit protection of an existing civilization revert to the guardianship of that existing civilization upon demonstrated activation. The activation is on record. The Setherian attribution is documented. The species connection is evidenced by the genomic key. She paused. The Tycho mechanism is legally Earth's. The plenary vote on the jurisdictional question was 14 in favor, 2 abstentions, and 1 opposed. The one opposed was the Veth Dominion, whose vote had never been in question. The Veth legal team immediately filed a challenge on 4 separate procedural grounds. Durin's team had anticipated 3 of them and had responses prepared. The 4th was novel, and they spent a frantic 6 hours constructing a response before the challenge window closed. The challenge was denied. The Veth extraction operation at Tycho was ordered to cease and withdraw under compact jurisdiction. Consul Prime Orif, when Durin passed him in the corridor outside the plenary hall, said nothing. He looked at Durin for a moment with the particular expression of someone who has concluded that a situation is temporarily beyond their preferred resolution and is already beginning to think about the next approach. Durin noted the look. He filed it, mentally, for later. The Veth extraction ships withdrew from Tycho Basin 14 days after the plenary ruling. They withdrew completely and correctly, which Durin had not entirely expected and which Thakur told him reflected a straightforward strategic calculation. The Veth were not interested in a direct confrontation with a pre-covenant artifact they didn't understand, particularly one that had demonstrated the ability to interrupt their systems without being physically touched. They were patient in the way that empires that have been doing this for 3,000 years can afford to be. They would wait. Durin understood that. He had started telling his team to plan with that understanding in mind. The first human team entered the Tycho site 6 months after the ruling, moving through a shaft that the Veth boreheads had partially excavated before their withdrawal. It was widened and secured over the course of several weeks by a joint operation between the Lunar Infrastructure Authority and a team from the Compact's Archaeocultural Office, the latter present because the site technically fell under preservation protocol even with human jurisdiction established. Durin was not part of that first team. He had specifically arranged not to be. There was something he thought was important about the scientists going first, about the moment of contact belonging to the people who could understand what they were seeing rather than to the diplomat who had argued for the right to see it. He received the report from Malin via secure channel 48 hours after the team reached the chamber. She had abandoned her usual economy of language. The report was long and detailed and contained, near the end, a paragraph that she had apparently written, deleted, and rewritten several times before leaving it in. The chamber was intact. 11,000 years of vacuum and regolith and neutron bombardment had left it operational, which Tesfaye had suggested was possible given what he knew of Setherian materials engineering, but which remained extraordinary to encounter in practice. The mechanism itself was not what any of them had imagined. The mass estimates had been accurate. The density had been accurate. But the form was nothing like a weapon in any conventional understanding of the word. It was a transmitter. 42,000 metric tons of Setherian engineering, condensed into a 40-meter structure, designed to do one thing when activated: broadcast. Not a pulse. Not a field. A highly structured, tightly encoded signal in a frequency range that propagated across several hundred light-years without meaningful attenuation. When the activation signal had woken it up, when the chromosome 7 sequence had been received by the control matrix after 11,000 years of waiting, the mechanism had woken up and begun broadcasting. It had been broadcasting continuously since the activation, and it would not stop until it received a response. Dr. Voss spent 6 weeks analyzing the broadcast content. She brought in a team of 12, including 2 experts in Southern linguistic structure and a signal theorist from the Korath Collective who had spent her career trying to decode exactly this category of pre-covenant transmission. What the mechanism was broadcasting was not a threat. It was not a weapons activation code. It was a message, addressed in a format that any sufficiently advanced civilization in the region would be able to identify, and the message contained a single primary statement with several attached data packages. The primary statement, once decoded, translated to something close to, "The species of this system has awoken, and they are under observation." Not protection. Observation. The attached data packages were a record of Earth, encoded by the Southern 11,000 years ago. Atmospheric composition. Magnetic field strength. The orbital characteristics of the solar system's planets. The thermal signature of life on Earth's surface. A biological snapshot of the species they had found when they had come to this system and decided that what they found here was worth preserving. The Southern had not left a weapon. They had left a record, and when the record activated, it told the galaxy that humanity was here, that humanity was real, and that 11,000 years ago, a civilization old enough and wise enough to build something that could survive that long had looked at the species on the third planet and considered them worth the effort. Tesfaye, when he read the final translation, was quiet for a long time. "That's not a last weapon," he said eventually, to no one in particular. He was sitting in his office in Addis Ababa, data panels arranged around him, the light from the window falling across his desk at the same angle it always had. "It's a first introduction." Duran read the report on the diplomatic station above Sarath, and then he read it again, and then he sat for a while watching the gas giant turn in the dark. The Veth had come for something they believed was a strategic asset. They had come because they knew it was there, and they had assumed that the civilization on the third planet from Sol had not yet found it and would not know what it was if they did. They had been right about the first part. They had been wrong about the second. The mechanism was broadcasting now, and it would broadcast until something answered. Duran did not know what might answer, or when, or whether the answer would be welcome. That was a problem for the years ahead. There were going to be many such problems. But sitting in the quiet of the observation corridor, watching Saratha's slow rotation and thinking about a civilization that had looked at early humans and decided to leave them a gift they wouldn't be ready to open for 11,000 years, he found that he was not afraid. He was, for the first time in a long and difficult year, something much closer to curious. He opened a new communication channel and began drafting a message to the Compact's First Contact Preparedness Division, which had existed as a theoretical body for 60 years and had never had a concrete reason to convene. It had one now.